Hi, I'm a normal man, and this is the Sigma 150-600 f5 to 6.3 DG-OS HSM Contemporary for the Canon EF mount. However, I have used this lens pretty extensively on my Canon R7, which is a mirrorless crop sensor camera. In March, this lens turned 11 years old, and after owning it for about 17 months, I still think this lens is worth it in 2026, especially if you're looking to upgrade from an entry-level 300mm zoom lens and are trying to get a bit more reach. Let me start by saying that I am not a professional photographer. I'm just a regular guy who likes to take pictures, which is why we're talking about this $800 lens instead of a 600mm f4 that costs $14,000. So why do I think this lens is good? I'll just start by showing you some of the pictures I've been able to take with it. I first started using this camera with my Canon Rebel T6i, my very first camera. So despite this camera's pretty poor battery life, I've been able to take some of my favorite pictures to this day using this lens and this camera, even after upgrading to the R7. The T6i boasts a 24.2 megapixel sensor and a shoot speed of about 5 frames a second. It is by no means close to the cutting edge glamour of mirrorless cameras that have come out in the last 6 years. It has no built-in image stabilization, and the ISO maxes out at 6400. All that being said, I hope that these pictures speak for themselves, that this 11-year-old camera lens and this 11-year-old camera body are more than capable of taking decent photos at the very least. The 150-600 has built-in image stabilization, which Sigma calls optical stabilization, or OS. And as we move to some of the photos taken with my R7, I think it does a good job of showing how well this lens can do when it's paired with a more modern, higher resolution camera. Many people do shoot on full frame cameras, but I am a crop sensor shooter. The Canon R7 is the best thing that I've got. So in my personal experience, I think this lens benefits a lot from being paired with an APS-C sized sensor. Check out this robin, for example. Is it my favorite picture I've ever taken? Probably not, but you can really get a sense of how large we can make our subjects when using this lens. We've all seen robins before, and they're pretty small. So what's cool about this picture is not only did this bird like the video and subscribe, we rarely get to see any subject, let alone a songbird, in such detail. After all, crop sensor cameras are inherently more zoomed in than full frame cameras. The crop factor varies between camera brands, but Canon is the most cropped in out of the big three. This means that when we account for each brand's crop factor, our focal length with this lens reaches 960mm on my Canon R7, and Sony and Nikon are just a little bit behind that at 900mm. So whether you're using a Sony 6000 series camera or maybe a Nikon DX mount camera, we're all gonna be able to go super far with this lens, which in my opinion is one of the biggest benefits, if not the only benefit, of shooting with a crop sensor camera. We can also pair this lens with the R7's digital shutter, which certainly takes some getting used to. You can end up with some rolling shutter, like jelly wiggle waggle back and forth, but this can be mitigated with a tripod, image stabilization, or just practice and steady hands. As far as like keepers goes, this lens is easily my most successful. I've gotten used to its quirks, and like most things in life, the more you practice with it, the better you'll get with it. And lastly, I just want to mention how much of a delight this lens is to shoot with. I remember when I first started using it, I just felt joy at being able to get closer to my subject than I had ever been able to before. When I was early on in my photography, I just was so excited because so many more photo opportunities had opened up by making that jump from 300mm to 600. And I still get excited, today whenever I get to take this lens out, because I know that if the stars align, I can walk away with a great and memorable photo. But I want to set expectations. This is not a top-of-the-line lens. We as consumers should not expect a top-of-the-line best-in-class performance from a lens that costs just shy of $1,000. Now, don't get me wrong, $1,000 is not cheap. I'm not saying that $1,000 is not a lot of money, because it is. What I'm saying is that at this focal length, this is as entry level as it goes. When we look at other lenses in this category, you either have lenses that don't go as far, like the Canon RF 100 to 400, or lenses that are much more expensive, like the Sony 200 to 600G, or the Nikkor 180 to 600, which are both about twice as expensive as the Sigma. There is the Tamron 150 to 500, but it's only available on X, Z, and E mount cameras, so it's not an option for a Canon user like myself. So yes, while this lens may not be perfect and probably not what I would consider cheap, there are not a lot of options for this focal range at this price point. And unless you're able to drop a couple of bands, this is one of the few options we have available. One of the trade-offs on this being a quote-unquote budget lens is the autofocus. When you don't have direct sunlight, the autofocus can struggle to find the subject sometimes. This is especially notable when you're trying to use any kind of eye tracking focus mode and the subject is behind some branches or maybe the foreground is a little messy. Tracking a fast moving subject through the air is not always guaranteed, and yeah, that kind of sucks and is frustrating. However, for what we're paying for, I think it works well enough. And you're gonna end up with soft out of focus photos, just like you always will with any lens. You know, it never works 100% of the time like you'd want it to. At least I've never had that experience. But when you do get a good shot, the photos are super sharp. I will say I really like how the photos look out of this Sigma 600. There's hardly any color fringing, especially when you compare it to another lens like the EF 75 to 300, which is a poop from a butt lens. You can get some crazy fine detail, especially when you stop down to f7.1 or f8, instead of shooting wide open at 6.3 while fully zoomed in. f8 is kind of the sweet spot I've found, and this is something I started doing over the last couple of months, and I've seen noticeable improvement to the sharpness of my photos. Now, because we're shooting on a variable aperture lens, you won't always have the blurriest background on some of your subjects, especially if they're far away. If we look at this bald eagle I shot back in April, like with my camera, you can see that the trees in the back are not necessarily blurred completely out. It's not that super creamy, blur that you would like to see. The best way to get around that is to get as much separation between your subject and the background as possible. So if we look at this Carolina wren, you can see that the background is very blurry, and that's because it was on a branch much closer to me than it was from the background. So the background was far away and I was close to the bird. Compare that to the eagle, where the background is really far away and the bird is also really far away. It's not as blurry, if that makes sense. What I'm saying is it's all relative. The more space you can give between your subject and the background, the blurrier your background's gonna be, and that goes with every lens. That's kind of just how cameras work. Going off of that, I think low light performance is fine on the Sigma 600. If your camera can go above 6400 ISO, I don't think you'll run into too many problems. But if your camera's a bit older, you might need to pay a little bit closer attention on where the light is, especially if you're in the woods, there's a dense canopy, and you don't have a ton of natural sunlight coming in. Going a little more into the qualities of the lens itself, we can look at this train picture here, and you can see just how round the bokeh is. I mean, that's like damn near a perfect circle, and it's right at the edge of the frame too. This lens does have 9 rounded aperture blades according to the manual that I read. Bokeh shape is all personal preference anyways, but I think this is a good reference photo for how it looks overall. This lens has a couple other notes I'd like to make note of. First is the weight, okay? This lens weighs 4 pounds, which is not light, but it's not overly heavy either. Look at me. I am a noodle man. If you are not a noodle man, you will probably have a different experience than me. But there are some things that I find difficult to do while using this lens. One example is like getting shots where the camera is below you or like low to the ground. With a 24-70, it's not very hard at all, but with this lens, I find it easier sometimes to just lay on the ground entirely, which is exactly what I did to get these American oyster catchers, which was a photo that I took just last week with this lens on the beach. Carrying it around is also kind of annoying. I don't like having it just dangle on a strap. I usually just carry it or hold it in my hands the whole time. Holding it up for extended periods can also tire your arms out, especially if you couple it with the rather long throw distance here. It's about 1.5 to 2 turns for me to get from 150 to 600 millimeters. However, I do think that it's very manageable. You can use a tripod if you like, but I found that it's more fun to just be able to walk around freely and not be tied to another piece of gear while you're out taking photos. When I bought this lens from B&H Photo, they also sent me this carrying case, which is rather nice. But the reality is that this lens just takes up a lot of space, especially if you're trying to fly with it, at least compared to other lenses you might bring instead. The Sigma 150 to 600 is kind of like the great sword of camera lenses. It can be kind of hard to use at first, but after you get a lot of practice with it, it can be really effective. I do think the focus ring on this lens is way too small. Even after using this lens for about 1.5 years, I can still struggle to find it quickly if I need to use it. I don't know if that was a design choice or some kind of mechanical constraint with how they had to build the lens, but it needs to be at least twice as wide in my opinion. This is kind of fixed in the sports lens version, but the sports lens version is 6 pounds instead of 4, and it's just more expensive. If this lens is ever brought up to the mirrorless camera generation, that is something that I really sincerely hope they consider changing in a new design. It is one of the few genuine criticisms I have about this lens. The Sigma 150 to 600 also has 5 different switches that we can use to tweak how the lens works in the field. So the first switch you switches between manual and autofocus modes, but it also has a manual override mode, which is what I find myself using 90% of the time. The way manual override works, your camera will autofocus like normal, but the focus ring on the lens is still active. So what this means is that if the autofocus can't find whatever it is you're looking for, you can manually adjust the focus without messing with any switches whatsoever. You can get close enough to your subject and just let your autofocus take it from there. I usually do this when a subject is obscured by branches or foliage and my camera's autofocus just needs a bit of extra help. Next, we have a focus limiter switch, which caps out the distance that your camera will focus to. So for example, if I switch it to the 10 to infinity mode, my camera will not focus on any object that is closer to us than 10 meters. Likewise, there's the 2.8 to 10 meter setting, which will only allow my camera to focus on objects that are between 2.8 and 10 meters. I have mixed feelings about this feature. I like the idea that I know something is going to be far away from me, so I can change a setting where my camera won't focus on branches or tall grass that's close to me and confuse the autofocus. However, in the real world, basically anything can happen at any time. If I have my focus limiter turned on and a bird lands in a perfect spot inside that 10-meter range, I now have to find the correct switch and then hope the subject is still there by the time I look down my viewfinder again. Or even worse, you forget the focus limiter is turned on at all, and then something lands and you're just frustrated and confused onto why your camera can't focus on it when it should be really easy. I say this because this has happened to me more than once, so these days I pretty much always have it set to the full setting so that I know that if it's there, I can shoot it. Pretty much if I have any autofocus problems, I'm just going to resort to using the manual override focusing mode that I mentioned earlier. Now, for the optical stabilization, this lens actually has 2 different modes, or you can turn it off entirely if you so choose. Mode 1 is probably the version of stabilization that you're used to. It just stabilizes the image. Mode 2 is specifically there to compensate for up and down vertical camera shake. If you're doing a panning shot tracking a bird flying across the sky, that would be a good use case for the second optical stabilization mode, because it's only going to correct the up and down movement and not try and mess with your horizontal pan. This is kind of more of a video feature in my eyes, so I don't use it a ton. I just stick on mode 1, but it's a nice thing to have. Lastly, we have the custom function switch, which through the use of a USB dock, you can change the autofocus speed of the lens, how the optical stabilization works, and also customize the ranges for the focus limiter. I've also heard that this can help counteract some of the focus breathing issues with the lens, but I have never felt strongly enough to buy or rent the dock to see if that's true. The manual also says that you should keep the custom function switch set to off if you don't plan on using it. Apparently, if it's set to one of the modes, the focus limiter switch will not work. So set it to off if you plan on using the focus limiter. And then we have a lock switch, which keeps the lens from creeping if you're carrying it around. It's handy. If you do decide to try this lens out or buy it, there are a few pieces of advice I would like to give. One is do some push-ups. Two is to watch Duade Patton's video on this lens specifically, and the camera settings you can use to reduce the focus breathing or focus issues with this lens. Since watching it, my experience with the Sigma 600 has been pretty much entirely positive. There will be a link to that video in the description of this video. Also, you should just check out his channel because if you like nature photography, it's pretty cool. 3 is to resist the urge to go all the way into 600 millimeters if you don't have to. There will be times where 600 millimeters still isn't long enough to fill the frame with your subject, and that is okay. What I mean is give your subject some room to breathe and give yourself some wiggle room in case something cool happens. There have been many times where I'm shooting all the way in at 600 millimeters and something will come in or the bird will take off, I'll take the picture, and it'll end up being cut off at the very edge of the frame. Whereas if I was shooting at 450 millimeters or 500 millimeters, I would have gotten the entire interaction in one frame and I would have left with a much more interesting photo. Do yourself a favor and just zoom out a little bit if you can, and there's a good chance that something will happen and you'll capture the entire scene instead of just a small bit of it. 4 is if you're using this lens on a mirrorless camera body, I highly recommend getting a first-party mirrorless to DSLR adapter. I know the first-party adapters are more expensive. The Canon one is about $100, but the KNF concept one that I first bought, which was around $50, didn't have as snug of a fit. There was like a bit of wiggle room between the lens and the adapter, and it's very noticeable on a large lens like the Sigma 600. So don't cheap out. For Canon, it'll be an extra $50, and in my opinion, I think that is worth it. In conclusion, I think this lens is some of the most fun I've ever had during my photography journey, and I would highly recommend it to somebody who's looking to step into that intermediate world of wildlife or sports photography. It has its flaws, but I think that's the trade-off for this lens being only $1,000. It has served me very well since I've bought it, and if you decide to rent or buy it, I hope it serves you well as well. If you're looking for a lens that is not as bulky but can still get some nice long shots, I encourage you to check out my video on the Sigma 16-300, which is pretty cool. Pretty cool lens. Anyways, thank you for watching, and I probably won't see you next time. Especially if you couple that with the rather long throw distance for this lens, which is about 150 to 600. What am I saying? What am I saying?